Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today we're taking a look at the Topping DX5. Now if you're anything like me, you're probably a bit fatigued by the constant flow of new products from Topping, SMSL and similar brands. And if you've watched my review of the Topping EX5, which came out a little while ago, you'll know that often I'm not a fan of their devices, particularly the all-in-ones like this one. So I have to say I was a bit skeptical both in terms of that fatigue that I just mentioned and also my experience with the EX5. I wasn't particularly looking forward to reviewing the DX5. But as you can probably tell from where I'm going with this opening, my experiences with the DX5 have been way better than what I had with the EX5, and it is a device that I like. It's not a device that I would say is perfect, but come with me now as I explain why I think the DX5 is a great addition to Topping's lineup.
Seem like every captain gotta maintain the cap. You can make change, don't change for that. Tell the whole truth, get paid for that. Bet you never fall off, you was made for that. You gotta be who you really be, shine from the inside. Cause they ain't really who they say on the outside. You gotta be who you really be, shine from the inside. Cause they ain't really who they say on the outside. Slide around the city with my day one. I ain't gotta worry cause they A1. Wasn't in the field and you can't come with us. My little shawty going stupid, going straight dumb with us. I'm a big time, still humble.
The Topping DX5 retails for $450 and I want to start off by saying a huge thanks to Appos for sending me this unit. As always, I'm very thankful to any retailer or distributor that sends me units for review, but as you'll know if you have seen other reviews like the Topping EX5, it never means I'm automatically going to say good things. Thankfully, on this occasion, I'm going to say mostly good things because I think it's a really nice unit, but any and all praise I'm about to share has definitely been earned. The DX5 uses a couple of ES9068AS chips for its decoding, and as always, I don't put too much weight in that, but what it does mean when you're using the ESS saver chips is that you're getting a very clean starting point with your DAC chip in terms of from a measurement point of view, but more importantly, it means that things like MQA are now baked into the chip. And so the DX5 can do full MQA decoding if you want it to. Whether or not you like MQA, I'll leave that up to you, but for those of you that are limited to only having access to Tidal, I do think sometimes it's not a bad idea to have MQA. I mentioned before that the ESS chips tend to measure very well, and the combination of the DAC in the DX5 with the amp in the DX5 results in a very proudly quoted figure of distortion at 0.00009%. Now some people may be incredibly impressed by that. My response is so what? I've heard devices with really great measurements sound pretty average, like the EX5, and I've heard devices that haven't measured quite as well, but still being adequate of course, sound fantastic. So measurements aren't everything. They're an indicator, but they're not the indicator, so I don't really pay much attention to the measurements. What I do find more interesting when it comes to looking at the specifications and the marketing of these products is what the unit is capable of doing and not doing. And in the case of the DX5, there's very little that it can't do. I've already mentioned that it's got MQA capability. It also outputs 1.8 watts into 32 ohms, which is plenty for any headphone you're likely to drive with it. It's got Bluetooth reception capability, which will handle all of the high-res codecs and of course all the non-high-res ones as well. And it does DSD if you need that across all of its inputs. PCM, so FLAC files and MP3s and things like that, they're all restricted to 192 kHz and 24-bit on coaxial and optical, but of course it does do high sample rates through the USB socket. And so this little box I've got in front of me for $450 handles everything you're likely to need it to. Comparing it to the recently reviewed FiiO K9 Pro ESS version, there's very little that the Topping here doesn't do that the much more expensive FiiO does. And I will revisit shortly my comparison of the two, and there are a few features that give the edge to the K9, but for many users, the DX5 is going to have everything you ever need, and possibly more. To help put that into more context, let's do a quick tour of the device and explain what you're getting here. On the front, we've got a 4-pin XLR output for headphones and a 6.3mm output as well. To be clear here though, even though it's got a 4-pin XLR output, it's not a fully balanced design. The DAC is fully balanced as I understand it, but the amp stage isn't, so the 4-pin XLR is just for convenience. And I actually don't mind that because it means you know you're getting exactly the same performance from the XLR and the 6.3mm connection. There may be ever so slight differences because connectors have their own properties and therefore can influence the sound ever so slightly, but it's not enough to ever worry about. Next to the outputs, we've got a nice clear white display that's going to tell you things like the input you're using, the outputs that are switched on, I'll get to that in a moment, the volume level, all that sort of information is covered really nicely and really cleanly on that front display. And then finally, we've got this lovely control knob with a beautiful notchy turn action, but it's a nice soft notch, it's easy to turn fast, it's accurate, it's precise, it works really well. And it's also a click button for turning the unit on, off, selecting inputs, and also choosing the outputs you're using as well. So the overall interface and the new visual design, because this is quite a departure from other topping products, everything about this I really like. I'll leave it up to you to decide if you like the new sort of rounded edges type aesthetic that Topping have chosen. I do like it, but I also didn't mind the old aesthetic either. Moving on to the back of the device now, and around the back we've got a bit more going on. Starting over on this side again, we've got a pair of XLR outputs, so you can run this as a pure DAC and or a preamp. You've also got a pair of RCA outputs for the same purpose, a Bluetooth antenna, a USB-B socket, optical input, and coaxial input. And finally, you've got a full-sized IEC connector. So there's no wall wart for this, all of the power supply circuitry, and I believe it's going to be a switch mode power supply based on the size and the weight, all of that's built in. While we're talking about the back though, I just want to circle back to the outputs. One of the things that I really like about how Topping have their devices set up is they give you lots of versatility with your outputs. So depending on whether you're using the remote control or the front control button, you can switch this device to be either just doing headphone output, just doing a line out through XLR, or just through the RCA, or you can have all three on all at once. And so it's a very versatile setup. It gives you lots of different controls over how you want to interface this device with the rest of your chain. If you've got active speakers, it's going to suit having actives and also headphones. If you're using it to drive another external headphone amp, you've got a different setting that might suit that better. So I love the fact that Topping have provided lots and lots of control, but also made it really simple to access. The final thing I'll mention while we're talking about remote controls and interfaces is that, as is normally the case with anything using an ESS chip, is that there are filter options available in the DX5. On this occasion, instead of the more common 7 filters, they've reduced it down to having just 3 available. So there's just option 1, 2 and 3, they're not called anything other than 1, 2 and 3, and as I flipped between them, I found the differences they made were pretty minimal. There is a slight shift in the character of the sound, but it's not really enough that I think I could tell which one was which, and I think if someone switched from one to the other without me knowing, I probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. That said, flipping through when I knew what I was listening for, I do think I like filter option 2 just a bit more than the other two. Option 1 to me sounds a little bit faster and a tiny bit edgier. Option 3 sounds a bit slower and a bit more spacious. And option 2 strikes a really nice balance between the two, based on what I'm hearing. But as I said, the differences are really, really minor, and I didn't go into a great deal of detail listening to them super critically to work out what I was hearing. The differences weren't big enough for me to invest that level of time and attention when all three sounded good, and I don't think you could really tell the difference if you didn't know it was being changed. And so with all that said, let's talk sound quality of the DX5. And the first thing I wrote in my notes when listening to the DX5 is the sound is unexceptional, and I mean that in a good way. It just presents a very clean, very neutral, and very honest representation of the music. It doesn't do what some of the Topping designs like the EX5 do and suck the life and dynamics out of it, but it also doesn't overplay anything too much either. It's got a very articulate sound, it's got a nice sense of clarity and attack. It sometimes is probably slightly overdoing that, but unless you're doing a comparison with another device, it's never enough that it sounds unnatural. Ultimately, my notes on the sound quality of the DX5 are fairly limited, because there's not a lot to say. It produces a good sense of left-right width, it doesn't really produce much depth, it's a very flat soundstage, as is pretty normal for these sorts of designs. But everything going on within that soundstage is fairly well separated, fairly well defined, very clean, and very articulate. And so rather than continuing on to try to describe a sound that doesn't really have much to describe, instead I want to talk about a few different elements of the sound, such as using MQA, and also if you were to choose to use this as a pure DAC. The first thing I want to mention is MQA, and I know that there are issues around the quality of MQA. From a purist point of view, it seems it's not lossless. I do believe that a true pure FLAC file generally sounds better than MQA, but if you're using a service like Tidal, you sometimes don't have that choice. you're locked in to their masters, and in many cases you can't even find a version of the album on Tidal that isn't an MQA version. And so in those cases, that's where I actually think having MQA can be a benefit. I feel like listening to the same track with MQA available or not available from Tidal, in other words, if you have two comparable devices where one is MQA capable and the other isn't, I believe if you're limited to an MQA only track, then an MQA capable DAC is likely to sound better than an equivalent non-MQA DAC. What I find from the MQA is it produces a slightly larger sense of space and a better sense of imaging. You do trade off, in my opinion, a little bit of detail and resolution, but the benefits you get in space and imaging quality I think are worth the trade-off if you are limited. Now, I can't stress enough, I know some people out there are strongly against MQA, and I can't stress enough, I would choose non-MQA if I could. My point here is sometimes you can't. And if you can't, that's when I think having MQA available could be a really good choice. So I like the fact that the choice is here, you don't have to use it if you don't want to. And for those that are concerned that we're paying extra for MQA, I think the amount that a company like Topping is paying for these chips that have it built in, the difference between that and an older non-MQA chip is going to be so negligible that it really shouldn't be a factor in decision making. And so let's now talk about how the DX5 sounds as a DAC only, isolating its amplifier stage and giving that duty to something else. In this case, the something else I was using was the Burson Soloist 3XP. Now that's a much higher level amplifier, that's $1,000 worth of amp paired up with a $450 all-in-one. So I absolutely expected it to perform significantly better than the DX5, and the point in trying this was to see just how much performance I could get from the DAC by giving it a better amplifier. For this test, I was listening to The Long Road by Passenger, and what I heard when listening from the Soloist was that the DAC stage in the DX5 is absolutely on par with any other DAC I've tried at a similar price. And when I say similar price, I mean up to about that $400 to $500 mark. And so thinking about it that way, you're getting a DAC that's performing at the full retail value of the product, and then you're kind of getting an amplifier chucked in for free. As I said before, the soundstage from the DAC and also from the overall device is pretty flat overall, but with a good sense of left-right width. I felt like from the Soloist, the improvements that I heard within that soundstage was slightly better separation of individual sounds, so the soundstage didn't get larger or any deeper, but what it did do was better define each sound within that space. I also felt like the Soloist had a slightly more natural timbre to the sound. So instruments sounded just a little bit more lifelike from the Soloist than I felt they did from the internal amplifier. And so what that tells me is that you've got a really nice quality DAC here, but the good news is that by not having a huge leap in performance going to the Soloist, what that says to me is you've got a good level of amplification quality to go with the DAC quality in here as well. So just to be clear, I'm not for a second saying that the amp in here is almost as good as the Soloist. What I'm saying is that for a DAC at this level of performance, which is exactly where it should be, maybe even a bit better than it should be for the overall price of the unit, for that level of DAC, you're getting almost its maximum capability through the internal amp. The Soloist was able to extract a little tiny bit more, but not enough to suggest that the amplifier in here is hamstringing the system, as does sometimes happen. Of course, if you pair something like the Soloist with a higher level DAC, you will get better sound. So I just want to make it really clear, I'm not saying this is as good as the Soloist in terms of its amp stage. I'm saying that the pairing here is optimizing the performance of both the amp and the DAC. The DAC is probably just a hair better than the amp, but they're both excellent. And so that led me to a couple of comparisons. And I'm not going to go into the comparisons in depth here because I've already covered both of them off in previous recent reviews. So if you want to know my in-depth thoughts on how the DX5 performs against the Aune X1S GT or against the FiiO K9 Pro ESS, I'll put links here in this video so that you can go and have a listen to the full review or jump to the section using the chapter cards to just hear the comparison. What I will do here though is just quickly summarise my thoughts of the DX5 against the X1S GT and against the FiiO K9 Pro ESS version. Starting with the cheaper X1S GT, I feel like the DX5 performs a little bit better than the X1S in terms of producing a slightly better sense of space in the soundstage, and also a slightly more exciting and dynamic sound. As I said in the full comparison in the X1S GT review, the DX5 in some cases, depending on your headphones and your music tastes, it could potentially become a little bit fatiguing quicker than something like the X1S GT, but it's only a very, very minor sense of fatigue or glare that comes into the DX5 when compared to the X1S GT. And to be clear, I'm not saying the DX5 is overall a glary or harsh device. What I'm saying is the X1S GT is a smoother device. And so if you've got a more aggressive headphone, let's say you've got a pair of something like an HD800, I do think the X1S GT is going to be a little bit more forgiving than the slightly more dynamic and articulate and slightly sharper sound from the DX5. On the flip side though, if you've got a slightly warmer headphone, like say a ZMF Atrium, an Apos Caspian, something with a bit more depth and body to its sound, that's where the DX5 is actually the preferable option. And having lived with both for a little while, both for the X1S GT review and then in the lead up to this review, I think if you were to ask me which one I was going to choose between the two, it's the DX5 I would choose. They're very, very close and very, very good, but I just like the interface, I like the versatility of the DX5, being able to take the XLR outputs and the RCA outputs. I think it's a very versatile device, and that's why it gets the nod. And so let's now talk about the K9 Pro ESS, and I'm just going to again summarize what I said in the full comparison that's over in the K9 Pro review. Comparing the DX5 and the K9 Pro ESS version, I feel like they're very similar overall, but the K9 Pro just has a slightly more natural timbre and tonality to the sound. And this is what I alluded to before, the DX5 just ever so slightly overdoes the sense of contrast and clarity sometimes. And if you do compare it to something like the K9 Pro, it makes the DX5 sound just a touch artificial. In isolation, you wouldn't notice what I'm talking about with the DX5 because there's no reference point to hear that subtle difference. But if you do have a chance to put it side by side, either with a different headphone amp or with something like the K9 Pro all-in-one, you do hear that there's just a little bit of emphasis from the DX5 and it makes it a tiny bit unnatural. Other than that, I think the DX5 performs incredibly well in comparison to the K9 Pro. And whilst the K9 Pro is, for me, the slightly better device, it's also more expensive and much larger. So if you don't have the space or the budget, and if you don't need some of those features like the EQ and the balance control that the K9 Pro offers, I do think the DX5 could be almost as good of an option and so much cheaper and so much more compact. And so I won't drag this out for the sake of it. I'm going to wrap this up here by saying I think the DX5 is a great device. It's compact, I think it looks good, it's lovely to interact with, and the sound is really, really solid. Personally, I'm still going to lean where I can towards a discrete amplifier design, like say a Schiit Asgard 3 or even the Schiit Magni, and my preference from a DAC point of view is generally going to be towards something like an R2R or a Schiit multi-bit DAC, if you can find it within those price ranges of course. But if you're looking for an all-in-one, those sorts of devices don't really exist. And that's where I think the DX5 is an absolute winner. If you need an all-in-one, if you want a sound that's clean, articulate, uncoloured and generally enjoyable, then the DX5 I think is a great choice. And so if you're in the market for an all-in-one, you're looking for a good option and you like the look and the sound of this, I'll put a link down below, first and foremost through to Apos for anyone that's in the US or Canada, and that's a way of saying thank you to them for making this review possible. It does also provide some income to the channel, and I deeply appreciate any purchases made using those links. For those of you outside the US and Canada, I'll see what global links I can find and put one of those in there too. And so as always, I hope you found this review useful. Hopefully it's helped you clarify which of these all-in-ones is right for you, or maybe that all-in-ones aren't right for you. I'll let you work that out. And if you have found this review useful and enjoyable, I'd love it if you hit subscribe, ring the notification bell and hit the like button. It helps me know the sorts of videos you like to see and tells YouTube to show you more content like this as well. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.